Hello and welcome to Talking Theology, the podcast of Cranmer Hall in Durham. My name is Nick Moore. I'm your host for this episode, and it is great to welcome Neil Martin. We're going to be talking about Neil's book, Galatians Reconsidered. Neil, it's great to welcome you on Talking Theology. Could you introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So as you said, so I'm Neil, and when people ask me what I do, I normally say that I wear three hats. So I am the Associate Minister of Oxford Presbyterian Church here in Oxford, and delightedly engaged with a busy ministry there. We're an ordinary kind of family church, but with lots of students and very engaged with university life. And there's lots of excitement and lots of opportunities to see God at work. So that's great fun. I am also a research associate in the Theology faculty in Oxford University. So just last term, I was teaching the Introduction to New Testament for our incoming freshers, which was also a huge privilege and lots of fun. I love teaching, so that's great. Great fun and very stimulating. And then the third hat is that I'm the director of a small Christian charity called Be Less, which is basically seeking to mobilize Christian graduate students in British universities to be effective as mentors, encouragers, evangelists among undergrads, something which I guess has kind of informally happened in British universities for a long time, but has become actually increasingly important as the universities become maybe slightly more self-contained and harder to reach from a church or parachurch perspective. The increasing number of grad students in universities creates a fantastic opportunity for them to be mobilized for that task. So we work in several universities now, and again, that's a burgeoning ministry and very exciting to be involved in.
Fantastic. Three very interesting and different things, but all with some synergies between them.
I hope so. I tell myself that when I'm trying to justify to my wife that this is a good idea to be doing. And I should mention, so I'm married, I have 4 kids, and I like to think a relatively normal family, although Ruth tells me that living right in the very centre of Oxford is not normal, and that I'm particularly not normal. But we'll let her, she can be the judge of that.
That's great. So today, as I mentioned, we're focusing on your book, Galatians Reconsidered. This isn't your only publication on Galatians, but it's something perhaps a little bit more popular, accessible that came out of the research you did for your DPhil, your doctorate at Oxford. You describe it as a 7-year adventure. Could you tell us about what set you out on that adventure into Galatians and what kept you going through those 7 years?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I have a slightly unusual journey into doing the work that I do now. So the first 15 years of my life after university, I worked as a designer, and that's very much my kind of vocational strength. So everything else is me trying to fake being decent at things. But I became a Christian shortly before I went to university. Have always been passionately interested in trying to understand from first principles up what is this wonderful kind of deposit of the gospel that we've been given, and wrestling with the Bible and trying to really understand it. And that ultimately matured into doing a MTS at Calvin Seminary in the States. We lived in the States for 5 years, and so I was given that opportunity and then encouraged to come back and do a doctorate. But it was really in the classroom at Calvin where this particular idea kind of began. I confess, as a designer, ideas come easily to me. So, I had probably 4 or 5 viable doctorate ideas at the point of applying, and led with 2 or 3 of them even in the application to Oxford. And I love now working with master's students. Often master's students don't have ideas about what they want to do, and I encourage them to get in touch because I have lots. So this was one of those threads. So sitting in the classroom, learning from Jeff Weimer, teaching on Paul's letters, I remember the quite simple question that this book addresses coming to me, and I asked it actually in the classroom. And I remember that moment clearly. And I remember, afterwards in dialogue with Jeff and then writing a few things down, coming to like an initial hypothesis of how you might handle it. And, that's doctoral projects begin in all kinds of different ways. I think there's a spectrum. Some doctoral projects are kind of pure exploration. I'm interested to know what you could learn if you chase this insight or this word or whatever, and those make good projects. But also you can have very much a hypothesis-led doctoral project where you have got a particular question and a particular answer that you have in mind that you want to set out to either falsify or verify. Both of those can be equally important. And so mine was very much of that latter type. And I think partly the reason why it was a long adventure is that I just had probably none of the skills necessary to answer the question that I posed. So, I was a beginning student in Greek at that stage, and needed to get that up to a pretty decent level to do some of the stuff that I ended up needing to do. A lot of the scholarship around what's the background to Paul's letter to the Galatians, understanding the life of first century Asia Minor, is German. So needing to build that as a research language as well, and then the work of the project as well. So it occupied me for a major essay at master's level, and then a 5-year part-time doctorate, and then probably another year or so's writing afterwards to produce the second book.
So at the heart of the hypothesis that you had come up with and were testing is the idea of regression. Could you just give us an overview of the role that regression plays in Paul's argument in Galatians as you see it, and why it's quite hard to give a good account of what Paul's doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would kind of take us to the passage that led to the question in the classroom, which I still think is a really great way to kind of get at this. In Galatians 4, Paul, writing obviously very directly to this seemingly kind of audience of relatively young Christians in a church which he himself has planted, probably on the first missionary journey. He writes to them, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not God's. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again?" So even in the English, how is it that you're turning back, returning to them all over again? Actually, in the Greek, I think there are 4 instances of return or regression vocabulary, that again, or going back, within the space of about 15 words. So it couldn't be more obvious that Paul thinks that these people are returning to something with which they have some prior familiarity. He actually uses this interesting Greek idiom, which translates well into English, palin anathen, again from the top, which you would say if you were kind of repeating a piece of music, take it from the top. And he thinks that's what they're doing. But if you think for a moment what they're doing, this is seemingly a group of relatively recently converted pagans. That's the reason why they're being encouraged to get circumcised, right? Because they're not already Jews. And the issue that Paul's addressing is that seemingly some Jewish Christians are influencing them to keep the Jewish law in multiple different forms, circumcision being the leading one, but also festivals and Sabbaths and various other things. Food laws potentially are in the wings in this argument. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, in what possible sense can a recently converted pagan be going back to something they've done before by getting circumcised? So that's the kind of the standing question. And then you asked very helpfully, where else do you see it? The answer is, I think in every chapter of the letter, you see him attacking this issue. Famously, when he gets into his kind of Hagar and Sarah material, he's talking about going back to something with which you have prior familiarity. Back in chapter 3, he makes the same case when he's talking about coming back to the law, which has previously been a kind of, a pedagogos is the word that he uses, kind of academic supervisor or someone ushering, Greek children to the classroom. The force of the argument is, look, what you're doing now is returning to something with which you have prior familiarity, and I could enumerate examples elsewhere as well. So I suppose the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how can Paul write a letter where that's a dominant part of his rhetoric, and yet it seems to make absolutely no sense of the situation whatsoever? And there's a fun moment actually in Augustine's commentary on Galatians, where I forget exactly how he does it, but he basically does the Latin equivalent of what in the world is Paul talking about? He says you can't get circumcised again, so how can this possibly be a valid way to make the point? And so I suppose the question that I asked was a question that people, readers of Galatians have been asking through the centuries. And I suppose my question was, well, returning to it now, is there a way that we can see this more clearly?
So if they're not returning to the works of the Jewish law, which, as you say, seems actually quite obvious when you stop to think about it, What is it that they're returning to? What is your argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of qualify that, I think the leading get out would be to say these people have been God-fearers in the past. So, if you do take Galatia as, I mean, there's famously debate about exactly where these Galatian churches were. The balance of the scholarship now would tend to encourage us to think that it's probably southern Galatia rather than northern, and I would concur with that. It's been some very interesting archaeological work that's fun. There's a wonderful, very inaccessible tome by Vasilias Breitenbach and a co-author where they basically look at, they show that in kind of monumental epigraphy in the late first, early second century, that the name Paul becomes very popular in southern Asia Minor. It's just an interesting indication of the kind of the footprint of Paul in this place. And there are lots of other evidences that you could look to. But let's say they're southern. And
just for listeners or watchers who don't have an ancient map of the ancient Near East in their heads, you talked about Galatia, you've talked about Asia Minor. Where are we talking about in contemporary
southern
terms?
Turkey. Yeah. So just picture that. Think of your favorite holiday destination in Turkey. So the Galatian region is kind of in that day, it was a sway through the center of Galatia and probably towards the southern end of that. The cities that we're familiar with in the first missionary journey, so Sidon, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, those are the candidates. And I don't think, certainly to track along with the argument I'm going to make, you don't have to commit to any one of those in particular. So forgive me, we've got sidetracked onto geography. So just remind me your good question.
Yeah. So you said it, unless you think that these are God-fearers who already had some engagement with the law for Jews, it seems most likely that they are pagans and therefore they can't return to Jewish works because they haven't ever practiced them. So what is it then that they're returning to?
Yeah, so that's right. So if you look at that first missionary journey, Paul meets a lot of God-fearers. So that's potential that they could have been, pagans who were involved in the synagogue in some way. But as you begin to think about it, it begins to not make sense. The defining feature of a God-fearer is that they don't get circumcised. That's what makes a God-fearer and not just a convert. And so the idea that they're going back to something that they've done before, when the thing that they were doing before is absolutely programmatically defined as being not the thing they're doing now, is equally problematic, if not worse. So I suppose the argument that I want to make in some ways is absurdly simple. And it's just simply grasping the fact, look, think about these people's pagan background. I had a lot of fun doing a lot of work on this, just trying to figure out what it looks like to just be a kind of 9-to-5 pagan in southern Turkey in the first century. And there's a lot of variety. But at the center of that variety, you would say, look, these people, there's a multiplicity of different gods that are worshipped. There are local gods, maybe gods associated with someone's particular town where they live. There are maybe gods that they've elected to worship for some particular reason through circumstances of life or their profession or something like that. And then there are gods kind of being imposed one way or another from the outside, worship of the Roman emperor, and there's been a back and forth of these external influences between Persia and Greece and Rome over the centuries. But in all of those forms of devotion, the people of southern Asia Minor in the era perceive themselves to be players at the table in the divine human game. They feel that they have a hand to play, and some of them will think it's a strong hand and that the gods can be manipulated by their action. Some of them will think it's a weak hand and basically, essentially the gods will do what they want, whatever. But almost everyone agrees that it's a hand that's worth playing, and that in order to be a responsible member of civic society, you need to play that hand. You need to show up, you need to make the sacrifices, you need to keep the gods on side and do everything that you can in order to try to make sure that if they're going to drop a lightning bolt, it won't be on you. So that's kind of the way that the thing works. And it's manifested through an incredibly familiar sounding variety of things that they do. They show up at sacred sites or at temples. They keep special festivals and special days that happen at a particular frequency. They practice sometimes forms of kind of ritual cleaning. They have foods that they will abstain from or foods that they will particularly eat. So just bear in mind, this is their life, and they've been doing this since their mother's knee. They've been making their offerings to their household gods and everything else all the way along. And then one day, this lunatic Paul shows up and basically says, hey, let me introduce you to the creator of the universe. Actually, all of this stuff you don't need to worry about anymore. And he has made himself available to you by grace through Christ. So, and he plants a church, he appoints elders, and then he legs it. And, imagine maybe a year or 18-month passing, and, a bit of social pressure starts to set in, and maybe a few bad harvests and that kind of thing. You can imagine yourself thinking, what do we have to do to attract the attention of our new God and try to make sure that our relationship with him is preserved? It's just a reflex thing to want to do that. And then some Jewish Christians show up and they say, okay, actually for millennia, we've been keeping the Sabbath and keeping certain food laws, and we get circumcised, and these are the things that we do. And you can imagine for these people who are these relatively recently converted pagans with all this history, for them, their thought would be, maybe it wouldn't even necessarily need to be conscious, but just in doing those things, the bit of their past which would be reactivated and reanimated is this idea that these are the things that we do to keep our God sweet. These are the things we do to maximize our chance of blessing and minimize our chance of cursing. So the thing that's interesting about that argument is you can see why it answers the question, why are you going back? What they're going back to is going back to paganism. They're going back to ways of pagan thinking, the pagan understanding of what religious action means. And what they're doing it with is Jewish actions. And the interesting avenue that it opens up is it means that you don't actually have to come to a determination at all about what these Jewish Christians intended. They could have absolutely intended that these people embrace some kind of works righteousness, classic old perspective, but you don't have to. There are plenty of us who stood up and preached in church, hopefully very orthodox messages, which have been taken amiss by people who have other prior commitments and understandings. And I think it's that Paul is alert to. He knows this region so well. Galatians itself manifests how clearly he understands its pagan context, with all kinds of allusions to mother goddess worship on mountains and various different local practices. And I think he's a sufficiently smart pastor to know that if you expose these guys to a bunch of Jewish rituals, or frankly, any rituals, it's going to reactivate all that stuff from the past. And for him, that is the thing that is inimical to the gospel. The idea that you can make the God of the Bible bless you and make him more likely to bless you or more likely to curse you by keeping him on side through manipulative action, for him is the absolute antithesis of what it means to be Christian. And I think that's the reason why he blows a gasket in Galatia in a way that maybe he doesn't, even in 1 Corinthians, he doesn't go, or 2 Corinthians, he doesn't go as nuts as he does here.
Now, a classic Christian view, and indeed perhaps particularly Protestant view of Judaism, has been to see it as a religion of works righteousness, to which the Christian gospel of grace is opposed. That is a view that has come under quite intense scrutiny for the last perhaps 50 years within scholarship, pushing back and showing that Judaism is actually a religion of grace, and there's a whole variety of perspectives on the law. And it strikes me as I hear you talk that, in a sense, your reading of Galatians, which is one of the key texts in this debate, is open to that kind of perspective, precisely because it locates the problem not within the Jewish law itself, but within the pagan sort of customs or approach.
Yeah, I think that's opening up a really important issue that the book seeks to address. So I think, as I framed it to you just now, I think Galatians actually tells us very little about what the Jewish Christian agitators, influencers really thought. So I think we need to be aware of the fact that we're projecting into the situation when we come to those conclusions, when the letter is a letter between Paul and the Galatian church. And we need to pay attention first and foremost to who they were and what their pastoral problem is. And so in some ways, the book, I wanted to subtitle it, Everybody's Right About Galatians, because I think that you can read it. The issue of who were these Jews and what did they think is an issue that the letter doesn't actually tell us that much conclusively about, even though that's been the main battleground that exegesis of Galatians has played in. So it's kind of an important rider at the start. I think the way that you introduced it, just saying, traditional Christian readings have seen like a hard contrast here between Judaism as a religion of works righteousness and Christianity as a religion of grace. hope all of us, at least kind of initially, can, we should all have a massive problem with that statement simply on the basis of a reading of the Old Testament. So we could have a debate about how Judaism or Judaisms have changed over the centuries that bring us to the first century. But when we come to God's interaction with Abraham, the fountainhead of, of Jewish conviction about God, which Paul liberally references here in Galatians, and it's a key touchstone for him, that should be impacting us in the way that we think about this. That is the moment where we see that God loves us because he loves us. He doesn't choose Abraham because Abraham is wonderful or amazing. He chooses him because he chooses him, and Paul himself kind of cites that moment that says Abraham believed God, and that was credited to him as righteousness. It wasn't his righteousness that led God to offer him relationship. And then you could say the same thing about, the later development of the kind of Mosaic and infrastructure. Again, famously in Deuteronomy, we're told that, God didn't love the Israelites because they were the best or the brightest nation, but he loved them because he loved them. So that idea that God's choice is prior is a fundamentally Jewish idea. Now, I think when we come to the era in which the action of Galatians is playing out, I think most people recognize there are multiple different Judaisms out there with different emphases. And I guess I would want to say, look, legalism, the belief that we can make ourselves right with the gods or the larger powers, however we conceive them to be, it's not a Jewish problem, it's a human problem. It's something which every single culture has its own version of. You see very legalistic atheists out there. You see very legalistic Jews out there. You see very legalistic Christians out there. And I think I would want to say, look, of all the different faith groups and ethnicities out there in the world, Jews are in some ways the best defended against legalism because their founding documents point in a different direction. They show another way. Now, it's really, really clear in the Gospels that there are legalistic Jews out there. Jesus meets them and he confronts them on exactly that ground. But that shouldn't surprise us or make us believe that we have to defend the idea that Judaism in its entirety is legalistic from bottom to top, and that then we have to use that as a way to read everything that's subsequent to it, or that we should feel we have to defend that territory against someone like Ed Sanders when he basically seeks to problematize it. I actually think Ed Sanders' book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism in 1977, it's a watershed moment because I think he makes just a really great case to say, look, it's not uniformly true that in the first century, Jews are just totally preoccupied with what deeds they can do in order to get themselves into heaven. All of the categories there are all retrojected from various different places, and it's not a good analysis of what's really happening. So I think the way that I'm presenting the underlying situation in Galatia allows us just to have the necessary flexibility to see this letter as really an authentic interaction with the world of the time. And I think the problem, if you go down the all-out legalism route, is that the letter starts to actually cease to make sense. And this is the point that's been famously made from various different places. I think the one that I've seen most frequently is actually in Acts 21, when Paul returns to Jerusalem after the third missionary journey, and he's challenged by the Jews in the city to say, isn't it true that you do this terrible thing of telling people not to circumcise their children? And all of us who see Paul as militantly against law and Judaism being, Jewish legalism being the only thing and a terrible thing in its own right, we're hoping he's going to say, yeah, you're right. That's exactly what I tell them. I've seen the light, circumcision is a terrible thing. And then we're shocked that Paul actually says, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. Let me prove it to you. And he walks into the temple and, kind of fulfills his obligations there. But I think in Galatians, it's shouting at us as well, whatever reading of this text you come to, if you want to read it responsibly, you've got to have a system that allows you to comprehend the fact that in the same paragraph in Galatians 5, he opens up in verse 2, mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Okay? That's completely comprehensible within our full-on Jewish legalism scheme. but track down just 3 verses to verse 6, and he says, "For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." And it's like, how can those two thoughts live in the same guy's head? Well, they can't if Jewish legalism is the problem that he's after. You've got to find a way which is, I would say, more realistic. And actually, the one of the things that was such a thrill about kind of working on this way of interpreting what it is that Paul's doing is that passages like that just kind of fall out naturally as being, you can see exactly what it is that he's trying to do.
That's fantastic. And this is something, as we've said, that scholars have been talking about for decades, but actually I think there's still value in it kind of filtering down all the way down to the way that we as Christians handle our scriptures with care, and also implications, no doubt, for relations with contemporary Jews as well. So thank you for expressing that so eloquently. I wonder, we've talked about Galatians a lot. You just mentioned Acts. Are there other places in Paul's letters you see evidence of similar pastoral concerns and approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really, really good question, and was a real eye-opener for me as I was working on this, because I think this falls for Paul within the larger rubric of consideration of people who have different backgrounds and different needs and concerns that we see actually very present in many of his letters. Famously in 1 Corinthians, famously in Romans, Paul goes out of his way to try to say, look, what happens if you exercise your freedom in the context where somebody else might actually be harmed by that freedom? And I think it's been very, very revealing to me to see that Galatians is almost like a practical case study of him working that out. So if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to turn up 1 Corinthians 8. So here we have a classic situation where Paul engages, first of all, on a kind of matter of theological principle on the question of eating food sacrificed to idols in verse 4. And he's probably quoting from the Corinthians when he puts in this kind of slogan, an idol is nothing at all in the world. And he essentially wants to agree with them and say, look, theologically, I'm with you guys. Like, that is what's actually happening under the surface. But then the thing that's really interesting is that he then goes on in verse 7 to say, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are, listen, still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it's defiled. And so the problem here is not that these people can't be doctrinally convinced that that slogan at the top of the passage is correct, but the issue is they're still so wired into the habits of going down to the idol temple and having food that's come from an idol, and it being just implicitly connected with a kind of veneration and feeling like you're putting yourself on the right side of the gods and you can expect good things to come to you. That he says, look, don't take someone into that setting again, because whatever their brain says in terms of conviction, this huge infrastructure of underlying habit and conviction is going to trouble their conscience to the point where he uses very bold language here and talks about them potentially being destroyed. Well, it's interesting, the same strength of language also comes up in Romans 14 and 15 when he addresses the same issue. And I think it's Galatians all over again. It's basically this issue that we've got. Paul is sensitive to where people have been at before they embraced faith in Christ. And he is really determined that unhelpful patterns of thought and behavior are not reanimated inadvertently by actually good, doctrinally accurate Christian pastoral practice, discipleship and preaching. And he's prepared to actually let some of that pass and to say, look, don't go anywhere near any of that stuff, at least initially, until your faith is more robust. And it's interesting, even in the post-New Testament context, you see the early churches really focused on this as well. I was really interested to read some stuff about Cyprian in Carthage in later centuries, where he, for the pagan converts who were coming into his church, he wouldn't even let them get baptized for 3 years. He wanted to catechize the past scaffolding of paganism out of them before he would then let them receive a new Christian framework and have it kind of muddied and distorted by what was there in the past. So I think Paul's fear is that if you picture these forgive me for a kind of millinery example here, but it's as if Paul's worry is that they're taking the mantle of Judaism, but they're going to drape it over the mannequin of their pagan past. And that however good those things may or may not be, they're taking up the shape, the underlying structure is a pagan structure. And what he wants to do is take time to obliterate the mannequin first. And I think in some ways, I mean, he himself says he could be a Jew to the Jews or a Greek to the Greeks. I think in the case of someone who really no longer has a pagan underlying framework and has a genuinely Christ-shaped underlying framework, I think he can see the mantle of Judaism wrapping around that quite comfortably. And so I think for him, when he's interacting with the Jews in Jerusalem, he doesn't have a problem with them going to the temple. I think he wouldn't have a problem with them celebrating the Passover, because he would know that they know what that means to celebrate the Passover in AD 55 as a Jewish Christian in Jerusalem is a joyful recognition of the fact that the sacrificial lamb has come and he died on the cross and it's done. Now, God in his wisdom and, in the light of the kind of growing global expanse of the church has done away with even the possibility of celebrating in the way that they used to. But nonetheless, I think that's what's going on. Paul doesn't think those things have suddenly become wicked or that they are a one-way street to legalism. But I think he says, be very, very careful about what you attach them to, because they can take up the underlying form of that thing. So it's interesting in Galatians, he uses this word stoicheia, which is the same word. If you travel to Greece and buy Lego presents for your children, you'll see on the side of the box it says this Lego set contains 650 stoicheia, so pieces, building blocks. And basically he's saying, look, Jewish religious rites and religious rites in general are building blocks, but it's all about what you build with them. The building blocks themselves are morally neutral, but if you build them into a structure that's designed to give you status with God, you're a million miles away from the gospel. So you've just got to be really careful that the habits that built those things into those works righteousness modes of thought, that they need to be eliminated before they can be safely appropriated. Does that make some kind of sense?
Yes. No, it absolutely does. No, it's great. And we'll turn now, I think, to ask that question of how that might apply today. Towards the end of the book, you say that your reading of Galatians helps turn it from something of a dead letter into a radical prophetic summons to the church. Could you unpack that transformation for us a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to have a stab at it. So, I mean, obviously, it's a slightly polemic statement to say a dead letter. It's clearly not a dead letter. But I do think sometimes preachers, I've struggled with it in the past. I think preachers die in Galatians sometimes. You find yourself for 6 chapters just saying, not by works, but by grace, almost to the point where that becomes a work. And it's like, oh no, I've kind of undone the good that I hope the letter would do. Most people in our congregations are not like actively worried about getting circumcised, or, maybe some are, but, it's not the biggest deal. And so it's easy for it to feel remote and archaic. But actually, I think it totally isn't. As soon as you've seen that Paul's problem is a pastoral problem, leading then to a critical theological and discipleship problem, where people have past reflexes kind of shaped by the norms of the world around them, and then their Christianity is being kind of colored by those reflexes and ceasing to be the very thing that it is, that we have to just be hyper alert to the fact that that's the world we live in. We live in a world that's more like first century paganism than any world since the first century. And we are absolutely dominated by the idea, as the pagans were, that there are things that we can do to make the future give us what we want, whether those are financial mechanisms or whether those are investments in our physical fitness or physical presentation or career or whatever it is. We feel that we can create a relationship of obligation between us and future events, and then feel embittered if we don't get what it is that we thought we deserved. And that's the context that, as Christians, we're speaking into, writing into, preaching into. And it's possible to write and preach all sorts of good and true things that can nonetheless be draped over the mannequin of that incipient paganism to very detrimental results. So I'll give you a couple of examples actually that are very present for us, because by God's providence, amazingly at Oxford Pres, we have been blessed with the opportunity to recover a building which used to be a church. It was actually the home of the Oxford Intercollegiate Christian Union during the 20th century, and then it became a restaurant. And it's one of only, I think, 2 or 3 buildings in the whole of Britain that have ever come back, having been totally architecturally transformed to be a hotel or a nightclub or something like that, to come back and be a church again. So it's a very special moment, but we're also very aware of the responsibility that comes with that, of how are we going to handle that transformation. We have to bring it back and make a bunch of decisions about what should a church be. So as we're doing that, we're asking questions about things like screens. There would be an argument to say that we should put screens up around the church in order to maximize people's ability to engage with content that we might want to present. But having really thought about this in the light of Galatians, there's a part of me that just wants to say, look, what do screens represent for our people, churched and unchurched, in the 6 days that they're not worshiping with us on a Sunday? Will screens represent a fast-paced world of choice in which you are absolutely the center and you are kind of like the key agent and decision maker? And the issue with it is in church, none of those things apply. We don't want what we preach and teach and sing on a Sunday to be received through a medium that makes me think this is all a matter of my choice and I can switch it off when I want. I am at the center of it. I am the key agent. None of those things apply. So in order to try to put into practice what I think is the message of the letter, our decision has been to have no screens at all through the entire chapel and to totally rethink sightlines and architecture to make that real. Or similarly with speakers or with like a preacher's platform, the use of the vocabulary a stage, lights, very visible sound systems, they can do a lot to actually really improve the quality of the experience. And so, we really understand the reasons why people would choose to do that. But again, in the 6 days that you're not in Sunday worship, if you encounter the word stage or spotlights or speakers, you are placed in a world of performance. And it's not just performance. In those contexts, it's also almost always a context where you are with like-minded people and you're there because you all like the same thing. So you're maybe the same age group or you'll have the same taste or all that kind of stuff. Now, immediately, as soon as I've said those things, none of them have anything to do with what we want to do in church. It's not a performance. It's exactly not a place where you're with people who all choose the same thing and have the same taste and are all the same demographic. It's precisely the opposite. And so not because what we would say through those speakers or sing from that stage would be bad, but simply because we're aware that just as celebration of the Jewish Sabbath could be really problematic for the Galatians, not because the Sabbath is bad, but because what regular festivals have meant to them in the past, we've basically decided again to have nothing, no visible speakers, to eliminate the word stage from our vocabulary, to hide everything we have to do with lights, and to really create in some ways quite an alien space, something that's very unlike the world, but very deliberately to try to prevent ourselves from unconsciously or unwittingly activating negative things which are really deeply unchristian from the world around us, and to allow us to actually allow something that's more true to what the gospel is to kind of fill us and surround us when we worship together on a Sunday. So hopefully you can see it jumps 2,000 years, but immediately into the world of projectors, amplifiers, all of that kind of stuff. I think Galatians is speaking directly to it. And there's just a gazillion other applications, but that's just one that's on my mind because we're working on it.
And that one intersects with recent thought about habituation and formation, thinking, for example, of the work of James K.A. Smith about the world is constantly forming us and churches are set to be spaces of counter-formation. I guess, I don't know if you want to comment on
I mean, I've spoken to Jamie about this, and I was really helped by his books on this. And I think the thing which is really interesting is that where he goes is back into the work of the church fathers to find these things, and that's right. So he goes to Cyprian, he goes to Augustine, and he's finding this awareness, and it's really a pastoral awareness that what's happening in the whole of our lives is forming us, and that there is a bi-directional relationship between mind and practice, and that it's not enough to simply believe something and then just assume that that will just flow outwards. The issue is if you actually physically do things, what you associate with those actions, the thoughts that were associated with those actions and the attitudes that were associated with them will be reanimated in you as you do it. In just as much as, when you're trying to encourage your kids to go to sleep, I don't know whether anybody's had this experience, but, the way to do it is to say, look, think, you can't control whether you go to sleep or not mentally, but what you can do is you're in charge of putting yourself in the posture and in the setting and in the situation of a sleeping person. So you're not going to go to sleep if you're sitting up reading a book. You're not going to go to sleep if you're watching a video or something. The way to go to sleep is to lie down in the dark, slow your breathing, be comfortable, and then sleep will just happen because body influences mind as well as mind influences body. So that's Jamie's kind of great insight. But the thing that's interesting is that the Galatians work allows you to go back behind Augustine and Cyprian, back actually into the Bible itself, and see we don't have to look to later pastors to see this kind of pastoral acuity. Paul is just an unbelievably acute pastor in these moments where he's dealing with these kind of accommodation issues in Corinthians and Romans and Galatians and elsewhere. He shows a tremendous sensitivity to, I guess, the cultural liturgies of these people's past. And I guess I would just really encourage us to think that through. I mean, I'm a minister in a Presbyterian church, very happily kind of reformed, and yet I would gladly say, look, surely this is one of the dominant issues in the New Testament. We absolutely want to dance on the truth of justification by faith. We absolutely want to kind of grasp and wrestle with the truth that the gospel addresses alienation between God and man, of course. And Paul does speak about those things. But we also need to honor the fact that if you take 6 chapters of Galatians, probably 3 in 1 Corinthians and 2 in Romans, add that up, that's just purely by page count. Accommodation turns out to be one of the most important things Paul ever addressed. A pastoral discipleship question of how do you get along with people who have slightly different backgrounds and ideas to yourself. So I just think we need to really think hard about how we're being formed by our prior Christian experience, by our experience day to day in a non-Christian world, and then think hard and talk together as believers in church contexts about how it's influencing us and how we can fight back with an authentic kind of gospel vision.
Fantastic. Final question. You've already spoken a bit about concrete examples of how your church is wrestling through current issues using this framework, but are there other examples of how your reading of Galatians, your work in Galatians, has shaped your ministry more widely, perhaps with relation to the Be Less charity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think one of the things that we are very aware of with Be Less, so Be Less is the name of the charity which is trying to make these bridges between graduate and undergraduate students, is again just recognizing that the paradigm which surrounds us, particularly in university towns, is the opposite of being less. It's about being more. I think the place where you really see this most clearly in Scripture is the pivot from Genesis 11 to Genesis 12. In Babel, you have this group of people who all want to get together and they want to use their combined strength to retake the heavens. They want to make a name for themselves and they don't want to be scattered. And if you think about what a university is, it's kind of like that, isn't it? It's all about getting together, amassing our strength, and then making an assault on the heavens, like making names for ourselves by doing great things, by getting great jobs, by publishing great work. And in some ways, there's a lot to like about that, but it's just really striking that the underlying ethos of it is completely overturned by the Abraham narrative that follows, and that Babel narrative completely overturns the narrative of the creation story. In creation, God is descending from the heavens to the sky to the earth to dwell with people. God comes down to us. We don't ascend to him. And so God's narrative to Abraham is, be scattered, get out. I will make you a name, and be prepared to be less, and in that being less, be a blessing to others. So I suppose what we're seeking to do with the charity is, again, to try to really kind of expunge that cultural liturgy of being more from the graduate students that we're working with. And we're encouraging them to be invisible encouragers, not to replace in any way existing ministries on campuses, but actually to enable them to just invisibly come alongside and wash dishes, print flyers, help Christian Union events, be there to be help with a Text to Toasty event or mentoring or whatever it can be, just to try to help the wheels of things move more rapidly and more smoothly in a gospel-oriented direction, but to do it in such a way that we don't reproduce that set of kind of underlying reflexes that come from the world. So I'm grateful for the question. I don't think I've ever quite kind of thought that through as clearly as you're encouraging me to do. But yeah, again, it's exactly the same thing. It's about trying to not import from, a not Christian paradigm around us, things that will then color and shape the way that we present things. And I just think it's a big deal for us as Christians how much of the external world we're importing into our framework. Even down to the way that we advertise our events, the way that we run conferences, all kinds of stuff. We bring a lot of the way it's done outside in without asking, is this the way Jesus would do it? And I think Galatians is a standing challenge to us, just to say, look, just be aware of the danger of that. Actually, in those three examples, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and Romans, Paul says some of the harshest and most weighty and grave things that he could say. The risk of destroying other people's faith is right there before us in all three of those letters. And the place where it happens is not actually necessarily teaching wrong stuff, but it's in the context of not being alert to how alien frameworks can kind of come in and populate and kind of recalibrate what should be straightforward gospel stuff.
Thank you. And that's a great challenge to end on, that challenge to wisdom and to self-examination and questioning at all times. Neil, it's been great to have you on. Thank you so much for all that you've shared with us.
Yeah, I'm really glad to do it. Thanks for the invite.